The first wounded man I carried across the border was still clutching a handful of wet grass. We had just crossed from Vietnam into Cambodia when the call came from the front. Medic. We need a medic now. I was 23 then. A young army medic with a canvas medical bag on my shoulder and more fear in my chest than I ever admitted. The morning air was heavy with damp soil, gun smoke, and the sharp smell of disinfectant leaking from a cracked bottle inside my kit. My canteen, dented from weeks of marching, knocked against my hip as I ran behind Sergeant Hung and Tan. Sergeant Hung was our senior medic. He was quiet, careful, and always calm, even when everyone around him was shouting. Before the war, he had worked at a small clinic near the coast. He used to say that after everything ended, he wanted nothing more than to deliver babies instead of pulling shrapnel out of soldiers. Tan was our stretcher bearer. He was big, strong, and always hungry. He carried dried rice in his pocket and joked that one day he would open a little carpentry shop back home. Wood doesn't bleed, he once told me. That's why I like it. That morning, none of us joked. The wounded soldier lay beside a broken tree stump. Blood had soaked through the bandage around his thigh. His face was pale, but his eyes were open. He kept asking if his leg was still there. It's there, I told him, pressing both hands hard against the wound. You stay with me. Hung cut away the cloth with his small medical scissors. Tan unfolded the stretcher beside us. Around us, the jungle had gone strangely quiet. No birds, no shouting, only the low moans of wounded men and the rustle of boots in the wet leaves. Then another group came out of the trees carrying a second man. This one was worse. A piece of metal had torn into his chest. Every breath sounded like air being pulled through water. Hung looked at him, then looked at our single stretcher. His face did not change, but I saw the decision settle in his eyes. The chest wound gets the stretcher, he said. The man with the leg wound grabbed my sleeve. He was barely older than me. Don't leave me. We're not leaving you, I said. So Tan and I carried him between us, our arms locked under his back and knees, while Hung walked beside the stretcher, checking the other man's breathing every few steps. My shoulders burned. Mud sucked at our boots. The dried rice in my pocket had turned soft from sweat and rain. We had only moved a short distance when the man on the stretcher stopped breathing. Hung dropped to his knees. Opened the bag. I fell beside him and tore through the medical kit with shaking hands, bandages, gauze, malaria pills, a syringe, one small roll of tape. Almost nothing for a man fighting death in the middle of the forest. Hung looked at me and said, very softly, calm hands save lives. So I forced my hands to stop shaking. Behind us, the border was already far away. Ahead of us lay the long road to Phnom Penh. But in that moment, the whole war became one wounded man, one muddy stretcher, and 3 medics trying to keep him alive. We did get that man breathing again, but none of us called it a miracle. In war, you learned not to use big words too quickly. Sergeant Hung cleared his airway, pressed his ear close to the man's mouth, then told me to hold the bandage tight against the chest wound. Tan knelt beside us, mud up to his knees, his big hands gripping the stretcher poles as if he could hold the wounded man to this world by strength alone. After a few long seconds, the man coughed. It was a weak, ugly sound, but to us it was life. Hung only nodded, move. So we moved. That was how my first real day inside Cambodia began, not with a map, not with a speech, not with the feeling of a great campaign toward Phnom Penh, but with 2 wounded men, 1 stretcher, and the wet jungle closing around us. The rain started before noon. It came down hard, sudden and cold, turning the trail into red-brown mud. Our boots sank deep with every step. The stretcher slipped twice. Each time, Tan cursed under his breath and caught it before the wounded man rolled off. His shoulder was shaking from exhaustion. but he still tried to smile at the soldier with the leg wound. "Brother, when this is over, you owe me a bowl of hot rice," he said. The wounded man tried to answer, but only managed a breathless laugh. By late afternoon, we reached a small clearing where our unit stopped for the night. It was not a real aid station, only a few canvas sheets tied between trees. The air smelled of wet leaves, sweat, blood, and disinfectant. I opened my medical bag and saw how little we had left. A few rolls of gauze, malaria tablets, some pain medicine, one bottle of antiseptic, and almost no clean bandages. Hung wrote every dose in his little notebook. He always did that, even under rain, even in darkness. He kept track of medicine like each pill was a soldier under his command. "We save what we can," he told me, "but we never waste." That night, no one slept much. I sat beside the man with the chest wound, listening to his breathing. Every time it slowed, I leaned closer. Every time he opened his eyes, I told him he was safe, though I did not know if that was true. Somewhere beyond the trees, artillery rumbled like distant thunder. Closer by, the jungle made its own sounds, water dripping from leaves, insects crying, men coughing in their sleep. Tan shared his last packet of dried rice with me. It was hard, damp, and tasted like paper, but I ate it anyway. My canteen was nearly empty, the metal side crushed inward from an earlier fall. I shook it once and heard only a small splash. Near midnight, another problem came. The younger soldier with the leg wound began to burn with fever. His skin was hot, his lips dry, and his hands trembled. At first I thought it was blood loss. Then Hung touched his forehead and looked at me. "Malaria may be starting," he said. We had tablets, but not enough for everyone who might need them in the days ahead. The road to Phnom Penh was still long. The main force of Pol Pot had not yet been broken. More wounded would come, more fever would come, more nights like this would come. Hung held the small packet of medicine in his palm for a long moment. Then he placed it in my hand. "Give it to him," he said. "Tonight he is the one in front of us." I still remember that sentence. In war, you could not save the whole world. Some nights, you could only save the man lying closest to your knees. By the third day, we stopped looking for a proper aid station and built one ourselves. It was only a small patch of high ground under 3 tall trees. But it was dry enough to keep the wounded out of the mud. Tan cut bamboo poles with his knife. I tied ponchos and canvas sheets between branches. Sergeant Hung found a flat stone and turned it into a small table for bandages, scissors, iodine, and the few bottles of medicine we had left. That was our hospital. No walls, no beds, no lights except a small oil lamp covered with cloth so it would not be seen from far away. The floor was leaves, roots, and damp earth. When the wind changed, I could smell everything at once. The sour sweat of feverish men, wet uniforms, blood, smoke, and the sharp sting of disinfectant. We worked until our fingers wrinkled from rainwater. Hung boiled water in a blackened pot to clean our tools. I washed dirty bandages, wrung them out, and hung them over a rope like laundry. In training, they told us to use clean gauze once and throw it away. In the jungle, that kind of rule belonged to another world. We saved every strip of cloth that could still hold pressure on a wound. Tan carried men in from the trail 2 at a time. He joked less now. His face had grown thinner, and there were dark circles under his eyes. Still, when a wounded soldier cried out, Tan always lowered his voice and said, "Easy, brother, we've got you." That sentence became our medicine too. Late that afternoon, a runner came in with 3 more casualties. One had a shoulder wound. One had shrapnel in his side. The last was barely conscious, shaking with fever so hard his teeth clicked together. His skin burned under my hand. "Malaria," Hung said. We still had tablets, but not many. We had also used most of our antiseptic. The wounded man with the side injury needed cleaning badly. If infection took hold, he might not last the week. Hung opened his notebook and counted our supplies without speaking. I watched his face and knew the truth before he said it. We cannot treat everyone the way we want, he told me, only the way we can. That was the cruelest lesson I learned as a medic. A doctor in peacetime fights sickness with everything available. A medic in war fights with what he can carry on his back. Sometimes that meant choosing one man's fever medicine while giving another man only water and a damp cloth. Sometimes it meant using half the disinfectant you needed because another wound was worse. That evening, rain fell harder than before. Water dripped from the canvas onto the wounded men's blankets. The jungle around us turned black. Somewhere far away, gunfire cracked and faded. Close by, the sick man began calling for his mother. I sat beside him through the night, crushing a malaria tablet into a cup and helping him swallow it little by little. He was from the Mekong Delta. He told me when the fever loosened its grip. He had a younger sister who wanted to become a schoolteacher. He asked me if Phnom Penh was far. I looked into the darkness beyond the trees. Far enough, I said, but we're moving. Just before dawn, when the rain finally softened, another sound came from the trail, the heavy steps of men carrying stretchers. Tan stepped out from under the canvas and froze. More wounded were coming. At dawn, the new stretchers arrived out of the gray rain. 4 men came first, then 2 more behind them, slipping and stumbling along the trail. Their uniforms were soaked dark. Their faces looked older than they should have. One man had a bandage wrapped around his head. Another held his arm tight against his chest. The third could not walk at all. Our little field aid station was already full. Sergeant Hung stood in the rain and looked at the wounded without panic. That was the thing I admired most about him. He never acted like fear did not exist. He simply put it aside until the work was done. Check breathing first, he told me, then bleeding, then fever. That was our order of battle. The push toward Phnom Penh had begun to move faster. We were told that the main force of Pol Pot was being driven back. But from where I stood, I did not see victory. I saw torn boots, empty eyes, infected wounds, and men too tired to lift their own canteens. The war on the map may have been moving forward. Our war was measured in bandages and heartbeats. We packed the aid station before noon. There was no time to stay. The unit had to keep moving, and the medics had to move with it. Tan tied our supplies onto his back, canvas rolls, bamboo poles, a cooking pot, and the last good stretcher. I carried the medical bag. It felt lighter than before, and that frightened me more than if it had been heavy. A medic with a light bag is a poor kind of comfort. The road was not really a road. It was a broken strip of mud between trees and abandoned fields. Sometimes we passed empty huts with cooking pots still beside cold ashes. Sometimes we saw civilians watching us from a distance, thin and silent, unsure whether to come closer. Hung always told us the same thing. If someone is hurt, we treat them. So we did. That afternoon, we stopped beside a ditch to bandage a Cambodian boy with a cut across his foot. He was maybe 12. He stared at my green uniform like he expected me to hurt him. I washed the wound with the last of the clean water in my dented canteen. The boy did not cry, but his hands shook. Tan gave him a small handful of dried rice. The boy looked at it, then at us, and finally put it in his mouth. No one said anything for a while after that. Later, the rain returned, harder this time. The trail became slick, and the stretcher poles kept sliding in Tan's hands. We were carrying a soldier with a broken lower leg, splinted with bamboo and strips of torn shirt. Every step hurt him. He bit down on a piece of cloth so he would not scream. Then Tan slipped. His foot went out from under him, and the front end of the stretcher dropped sideways into the mud. The wounded man cried out. A sharp sound that cut through the rain. I threw myself down to hold the splint in place. "Don't move him," Hung shouted. For one terrible moment, I thought the broken bone had shifted. If it had, we might lose the leg before we ever reached Phnom Penh. Tan got up slowly. Mud covered his face and chest. His hands were shaking, not from fear, but from exhaustion. "I'm sorry," he whispered. The wounded man looked at him and said, "You didn't let me fall all the way." That was enough. We reset the stretcher, tightened the bamboo splint, and moved on, but as Tan lifted his end again, I saw blood spreading through the fabric on his shoulder. A thin red line ran down his sleeve. "You're hit," I said. Tan looked away. "It's nothing." In the jungle, nothing usually meant something we did not have time to face yet. Tan said the blood on his shoulder was nothing. But I had been a medic long enough by then to know that men lied about pain when other men were worse off. We stopped under a line of thin trees just before dark. The rain had slowed to a mist, but everything we owned was already wet, our uniforms, our blankets, our bandages, even the dried rice wrapped in cloth at the bottom of my pack. Sergeant Hung ordered Tan to sit down and remove his shirt. Tan shook his head. "Treat the others first." Hung looked at him the way an older brother looks at a stubborn younger one. "You are one of the others." The wound was not deep, but it was dirty. A metal fragment had cut across the top of his shoulder and left mud pressed into the torn skin. I cleaned it with a little boiled water and the last drops of antiseptic. The smell rose sharp and familiar, mixing with the smell of wet earth. Tan clenched his jaw but did not make a sound. "You still want to be a carpenter?" I asked, trying to keep him awake. He gave me a tired smile. "More than ever." Then he looked at the medical bag beside me. "How bad is it?" I did not answer. Inside the bag, there were 2 rolls of gauze, a few malaria tablets, 1 small packet of pain medicine, some tape, and a pair of scissors that had begun to rust at the hinge. We had started the journey from the border with enough supplies to make me feel like a real medic. Now every item looked too small for the war around us. That night, 2 serious cases came in almost together. The first was a young soldier with a stomach wound. He was conscious, but his breathing was shallow, and his hands kept searching for something that was not there. The second was older, maybe 30, with a crushed foot and a fever climbing fast. Both needed pain medicine. Both needed clean dressings. Both needed more than we had. Hung opened his notebook, but this time he did not write. He only stared at the little packet of medicine in his palm. I knew what he was thinking. The stomach wound might kill quickly. The crushed foot might kill slowly. Through infection and fever, one man was slipping away in front of us. The other still had a chance if we could keep him stable until evacuation. War never asked clean questions. Hung handed me the medicine. "Use it for the stomach wound," he said. The older soldier with the crushed foot heard him. His face was gray with pain, but he nodded before I could say anything. "Give it to him," he whispered. "I can wait." I still see his eyes when I remember that night. Not brave like in movies. Just tired, frightened, and human. I gave the medicine to the young soldier and dressed the older man's foot with the cleanest cloth I could find. He bit down on his own sleeve while I worked. Tan held his hand. Hung checked his pulse again and again. No one spoke for a long time afterward. Outside the canvas, the forest breathed in darkness. Somewhere ahead was Phnom Penh. Somewhere ahead, they said, the main force of Pol Pot was being broken. But under that leaking shelter, victory felt far away. What I felt was the weight of every choice we made because our bag was too light. Before dawn, the radio operator came running through the mud. "The evacuation route changed," he said. "We lost contact with the forward station." Hung closed his notebook. That meant we had wounded men to move. Almost no medicine left, and no clear place to take them. By the time we reached the outskirts of Phnom Penh, I no longer knew what day it was. The march from the border had become a blur of mud, fever, blood, and short stops under trees. We moved when the unit moved. We treated men when they fell. We slept in pieces, sometimes sitting up with our backs against ammunition crates, sometimes not sleeping at all. The radio contact with the forward medical station had been lost before dawn. That meant we could not send our wounded along the route we had planned. Sergeant Hung studied a damp map spread across a wooden crate, but the rain had softened the paper until the roads looked like veins under skin. Tan stood beside him with his bandaged shoulder hidden under his shirt. He still carried one end of the stretcher, though I could see the pain in the way he moved. Every time I told him to rest, he answered the same way. When the wounded rest, I'll rest. Near noon, we found a truck stuck axle deep in mud beside an abandoned road. It was supposed to carry 3 wounded soldiers toward the rear, but the tires only spun and sank deeper. One of the men in the back had lost too much blood from a thigh wound. His bandage was already soaked through. Hung climbed into the truck and checked him. Then he looked at me. "We cannot wait for this truck." The driver protested. "I can get it out." Hung shook his head. "Not before he dies." So we unloaded the wounded under a sky the color of dirty metal. Tan and another soldier pulled the stretcher free. I cut away the soaked bandage and pressed fresh gauze against the wound. Fresh was a generous word. It had been washed, dried near smoke, folded, and saved for the worst case. This was the worst case. The wounded man grabbed my wrist. "Am I going to make it?" I wanted to say yes quickly. Young medics do that. They offer hope like medicine, even when they are not sure it will work. But I had learned something since crossing the border. So I told him, "You keep breathing. I'll keep working." That was all I could promise. As we prepared to move him by stretcher, people began appearing from the broken houses along the road. Then civilians, old men, women holding children. A girl no older than 10 stood barefoot in the mud with a strip of cloth wrapped around her arm. Blood had dried black on her fingers. No one told us what to do. Hung only looked at her, then looked at me. I cleaned her wound with boiled water and a corner of cloth. She did not cry. She watched every movement of my hands, as if deciding whether Vietnamese soldiers were men to fear or men who might help her live another day. Tan gave her the last piece of dried rice from his pocket. She took it with both hands. For a moment, the road went quiet. Even the distant gunfire seemed far away. I remember thinking that this was what war never showed on maps: children in mud, soldiers bleeding in trucks, medics counting bandages like coins. Then shots cracked from the far end of the road. Everyone dropped low. The girl froze in front of me. Tan reached out with his good arm and pulled her behind the truck. Hung shouted for us to move the stretcher into the ditch. The wounded man on it groaned as we lifted him. The main force of Pol Pot was being broken somewhere ahead, they told us, but right there, on that muddy road outside Phnom Penh, the war was not broken yet. And we still had men to carry. The shots came from the far end of the road, sharp and close enough to make the mud jump beside the truck. Everyone moved at once. Soldiers pulled the civilians down behind the wheels. Tan dragged the barefoot girl into the ditch with his good arm. Sergeant Hung shouted for us to get the stretcher low, but the wounded man on it was bleeding again. The bandage on his thigh had turned dark and heavy. "We have to move," someone yelled. I heard him, but my hands stayed on the wound. The man on the stretcher was young, maybe 19. His lips had gone pale, and his eyes kept rolling toward the sky. If we lifted him too fast, he would bleed out before we reached cover. If we stayed too long, we could all be hit. That was the kind of choice war gave a medic, not right or wrong, only bad and worse. Hung crawled beside me through the mud. "Can you stop it? I need a few minutes." He looked down the road. Bullets cracked through leaves above us. Then he looked at Tan, at the civilians, at the two other wounded men waiting to be moved. We may not have a few minutes. I still remember the weight of that sentence. My medical bag lay open beside my knee. Inside were scraps of gauze, tape, rusting scissors, and almost nothing else. I tore a strip from my own undershirt and packed it hard against the wound. The soldier cried out and grabbed my sleeve. "Don't let me die here," he whispered. I wanted to tell him he would not. I wanted to make the kind of promise men make when they are scared. But Hung had taught me better. "Stay with me," I said. "Breathe when I tell you." Tan slid down beside us, his shoulder bleeding through his shirt again. "Tell me what to do," he said. "You should be in cover," I snapped. He gave me a tired look. "So should you." There was no time to argue. I told him to press both hands above the wound while I tightened the improvised dressing. His face twisted from the pain in his own shoulder, but he did not let go. Hung kept one hand on the wounded man's pulse and the other on his rifle. Watching the road. Those minutes felt longer than the whole march from the border. The smell of wet earth filled my nose. Rainwater ran down my neck. Somewhere behind me, the little Cambodian girl was crying without making a sound. I remember thinking that Phnom Penh was close now, that the main force of Pol Pot was breaking somewhere beyond the smoke. But none of that mattered if this boy died under my hands. Finally, the bleeding slowed. Not stopped, slowed. Hung saw it too. "Now we move." We lifted the stretcher low and carried him into the ditch, then through a gap behind the abandoned houses. Tan stumbled once, but this time he did not fall. The wounded soldier breathed in short, harsh pulls. I counted each one like it was money I owed. 1 breath. 2. 3. Only when we reached the low wall behind the houses did I realize my own hands were shaking. Hung noticed and pressed the canteen into my palm. It was almost empty, dented badly on one side. "Drink," he said. I took one small mouthful and passed it to Tan. No one spoke for a while. The firing moved farther down the road, and the civilians began to crawl away from the truck. The little girl looked back once, still holding the piece of dried rice Tan had given her. That was the first time I truly understood something. We were marching toward Phnom Penh. Yes, we were part of a campaign to break Pol Pot's forces. Yes, but for a medic, the war was always smaller than history. It was one bleeding wound, one stretcher, one friend refusing to leave you, and a few stolen minutes that decided whether a man would see another sunrise. By the next morning, the gunfire had moved farther away. At first, none of us trusted the quiet. In the jungle and along those broken roads, silence could mean safety, or it could mean something worse waiting ahead. Sergeant Hung still made us keep the wounded low behind a crumbling wall until the scouts returned. Tan sat beside me with his back against an old cooking stove, his bandaged shoulder stiff, his face gray from blood loss and exhaustion. "You look terrible," I told him. He gave me a weak smile. "Then I must still be alive." That was Tan. Even when pain bent him in half, he tried to leave a little room for humor. The scouts came back near noon and said the road ahead was open. The main force of Pol Pot was pulling back, broken into smaller groups. To the infantrymen, that sounded like progress. To us medics, it meant the wounded would keep coming. But maybe not as fast. Maybe we would finally have time to breathe. We moved into a deserted school building on the edge of Phnom Penh and turned one classroom into a temporary aid station. The roof leaked in 3 places. The chalkboard still had faded Khmer writing on it. Children's benches were pushed against the wall to make space for stretchers. I laid out our supplies on a teacher's desk: scissors, tape, a few gauze pads, malaria tablets, a bottle of iodine, and a small pile of cloth strips we had washed so many times they felt thin as paper. It was not much, but after days in the mud, that classroom felt almost like a hospital. The wounded man with the thigh injury was still alive. His breathing had grown steadier. The soldier with the crushed foot had a fever, but it had not taken him yet. The Cambodian girl with the wounded arm sat near the door with her mother, watching us work. Every so often, she looked at Tan, as if she remembered the dried rice he had given her. For the first time in many days, I heard no shouting for a medic. That quiet did something strange to me. While the fighting was close, there was no time to think. Hands moved, bandages tightened, medicine was counted, men were lifted, carried, turned, and cleaned. But when the guns grew distant, the mind began to fill the empty space. I thought of the border behind us. I thought of the first man who had stopped breathing on the stretcher. I thought of all the choices we had made with too little medicine and too many wounded. Hung must have been thinking too, because he sat down on the floor and opened his notebook. His handwriting, usually neat, had started to shake. I watched him try to write a dose beside a soldier's name, but the pencil slipped from his fingers. Hung, I said. He blinked like a man waking from deep water. I'm fine. He was not fine. His skin was hot, and his shirt was soaked through though the room was cool. I touched his forehead and felt fever burning under my palm. For days he had stood over everyone else, measuring their pulse, counting their tablets, telling them to drink water. He had forgotten to count himself. Tan saw my face and struggled to stand. Don't, I told him. You'll tear your wound open. Hung tried to wave us away. Treat the others first. I heard his own words come back through my mouth. You are one of the others. For a moment, he looked at me as if he wanted to argue. Then his shoulders dropped. The strongest man in our little team finally let himself become a patient. Outside, Phnom Penh lay under a pale, tired sky. Somewhere beyond the city, the campaign was still moving. But in that classroom, our victory was smaller. Hung swallowed a malaria tablet. Tan slept sitting up, and I stayed awake beside them, listening to the first quiet night we had earned. By morning, Sergeant Hung's fever had come down a little, but he still looked like a man who had aged 10 years overnight. He tried to stand before sunrise, reaching for his notebook as if the war could not continue unless his hand was the one writing in it. I took the notebook away from him. For once, he did not argue. He only leaned back against the classroom wall and closed his eyes. That was when I understood how tired we all were. Outside the school building, Phnom Penh was waking slowly under a pale sky. Smoke hung over rooftops. A few civilians moved along the street with bundles on their backs, stepping carefully as if the ground itself could not be trusted. Somewhere in the distance, engines rumbled. The push from the border had reached the city, and the main force of Pol Pot had been shattered. But the work of a medic did not end when the shooting moved away. We spent that day preparing the wounded for transfer. The soldier with the thigh wound was still alive. His face had color again, and when I changed his dressing, he looked at me and said, "You were the one in the ditch." I nodded. "I thought I died there," he said. "So did I," I answered before I could stop myself. He smiled weakly. "Then I'm glad we were both wrong." The older soldier with the crushed foot was not smiling. His fever had dropped, but infection had already taken part of the wound. Hung, sitting nearby with a blanket around his shoulders, watched me clean it. His eyes were heavy but clear. Slowly, he said, "Do not rush pain." That was the kind of lesson he gave. Simple, quiet, impossible to forget. Tan helped carry the men out when the transport finally arrived. His shoulder had stiffened badly, yet he refused to let anyone else take his place. Before climbing into the truck, the Cambodian girl with the wounded arm came back with her mother. She did not speak Vietnamese. We did not speak Khmer. Still, she held out something wrapped in cloth. Inside was a small wooden button. Maybe it had come from a shirt. Maybe from a school uniform. I never knew. Tan accepted it with both hands, then gave it to me. You keep it, he said. You're the one who remembers things. I put it in the pocket of my medical bag. Later that afternoon, the casualty list came. No one ever forgets the first time he reads names that will not answer roll call again. Some were men I had treated. Some were men I had only seen carried past under rain. One name belonged to the soldier with the chest wound from our first day across the border. He had lived long enough to reach the rear station, but not long enough to go home. I sat alone behind the school building and opened my medical bag. It smelled of iodine, damp cloth, and old blood. At the bottom, beneath folded gauze and malaria tablets, I found a strip of bandage tied in a knot. I remembered tying it around that man's chest while Hung told me to keep my hands calm. For a while, I could not move. Tan found me there. He sat beside me without saying anything. After some time, he pulled a small handkerchief from his pocket. It was blue, faded, and carefully folded. My mother gave me this. He said, if I don't make it home, you take it back. I pushed it back into his hand. You'll take it yourself. He looked toward the road where the trucks had gone. Promise me anyway. I did not want to promise. Promises felt dangerous in war. But I nodded. That evening, we received orders to move again at first light. Phnom Penh was behind us now, but the wounded were still ahead. More than 40 years have passed, but some mornings I still wake up smelling wet earth and iodine. My hair is white now. My hands are slower. The war that carried us from the border to Phnom Penh has become history in books, maps, and speeches. People speak of campaigns, fronts, victories, and the breaking of Pol Pot's main force. I understand all of that. I was there, but when I close my eyes, I do not see arrows moving across a map. I see a stretcher sinking into mud. I see Sergeant Hung's notebook, its pages swollen from rain, every dose of medicine written carefully as if order could hold back death. I see Tan with blood on his shoulder, still lifting his end of the stretcher and saying, when the wounded rest, I'll rest. We did move again after Phnom Penh. There were more wounded, more fevers, more nights when the jungle seemed to breathe around us. But something had changed. The hardest push was behind us. The road from the border to the city had taken pieces from each of us. Pieces we did not know how to name. Hung survived his fever. He went home years later and, just as he once dreamed, worked in a small clinic. The last letter I received from him said he had delivered twins during a storm and thought of our leaking classroom aid station. At least this time, he wrote, the patients arrived crying loudly. That sounded like Hung. Tan also made it home. He did become a carpenter. The first chair he built, he told me, leaned badly to one side, like our old stretcher. He joked, he kept his mother's blue handkerchief in a drawer in his workshop. I know because he showed it to me when I visited him many years after the war. As for me, I carried home a few things no metal could explain. The small wooden button from the Cambodian girl, Hung's old pencil, worn short from writing medicine doses, a pair of rusted medical scissors, and my dented canteen, crushed on one side, the same one I passed to Tan after those minutes in the ditch outside Phnom Penh. That canteen sits on my desk now. Sometimes my grandchildren ask why I keep such an ugly old thing. I tell them it once held water when water meant life. I tell them it was passed from hand to hand among men who were scared, hungry, bleeding, and still unwilling to leave one another behind. I do not tell them everything. I do not tell them about the names on the casualty list, or the soldier who asked if he would live, or the older man who gave up his pain medicine for someone worse off. Some memories are too heavy to place in a child's hands. But I do tell them this. A medic does not win a war by firing a weapon. A medic fights by kneeling in the mud, by staying calm when his hands want to shake, by choosing life again and again even when there is not enough medicine, not enough time, and not enough light. From the border to Phnom Penh, We helped break the force of Pon Pot. That is what history says. What I remember is simpler. We carried our friends. We shared our last dried rice. We kept breathing for the men who could not. And somehow, through all that mud and blood and fear, we carried a piece of one another home.